We are at the end of the chapter of oppression rather than the beginning of a new one. Palestine was not always the first choice of the Zionists. I don't think this time Palestinians are fooled by that. I don't think they really believe that the political Islamic groups would liberate them. Sinwar, Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, was released in exchange of prisoners. Big question is rather, are Jews willing to live as equal citizens? Because Palestinians are willing to live as equal citizens.
Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to our show, please smash that subscribe button. Also consider joining our membership on YouTube, be a Patreon, or just donate through the link given in the description box. In either case, do watch our show, hit likes, shares, and comment. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest today, Professor Ilan Pappe. Professor Pappe is an Israeli historian, political scientist, and a former politician. Professor Pappe, welcome to India and Global Left.
Thank you. Very glad to be on your program.
We have been covering the current context of the genocide unfolding in Palestine with a lot of people, and a lot of people say that you can't understand what's going on at the moment without understanding its history, that everything didn't start on October 7th. So I thought, given you are one of the foremost historian of this conflict or settler colonialism, as you talk about, can we cover the history in real quick, 45 minutes to 1 hour? So let's start with Zionism itself. There is a lot of confusion whether it's religious, cultural, or political. So tell us what Zionism is, and also maybe what's the link of Zionism with Palestine in specific?
Well, Zionism is an ideological movement that emerged in different places in the second half of the 19th century. It was both an evangelical Christian idea and a Jewish one. From a Christian evangelical point of view, it was a very religious notion that saw the return, as they would put it, the return of the Jews to Palestine as God's will and part of a divine scheme that would eventually bring back Jesus Christ, the end of time, and so on. So there was a lot of support for the idea of colonizing Palestine by sending Jews from Europe and elsewhere in the world to settle there, with the hope that this is really part of a religious scheme. And that notion influenced Jewish intellectuals and activists, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, who were worried about the rise of anti-Semitism in their countries. And they saw an alliance here. Of course, they came from a different perspective to the idea of creating a Jewish state in Palestine. They were not Christians, and they did not subscribe to the Christian theology, but they saw this as an ally. They saw the evangelical Christians as allies to an idea that they supported for two reasons. One, because, as I said, anti-Semitism was on the rise, and some of them thought that maybe creating a Jewish state outside of Europe would be the only solution to deal with the animosity and racism towards Jews. Secondly, they also wanted to modernize the Jewish life and Judaism altogether. They were infatuated by romantic nationalist ideas that were very popular around them. This is the period that we call in the history of Europe as the Spring of Nations, where a lot of groups, some of them are just cultural or ethnic or religious, begin to define themselves in national, but not just national terms, but romantic national terms, which means it's more based on race than anything else. So this combination of trying to redefine Judaism as nationalism and not just as a religion, and being supported by important figures in the evangelical Christian church pushed a group of young Jews, especially from Eastern Europe, to begin settling in Palestine. Now, Palestine was not always the first choice of the Zionists. I mean, if you're looking for, a safe haven because Europe is not safe for Jews, you can also look for different places. And in fact, some of the leaders of Zionism were willing to consider other destinations, but it was the romantic nationalist impulse that led them to say, we can't just look for a safe haven. It has to be our ancient nation homeland, national homeland. So, and that fitted very well also with the evangelical Christian idea that the Jews were a race and not just a religion. So I would say that in the beginning of the 20th century, they honed on Palestine and kind of disregarded, or discarded any other place in the world for trying to implement this idea of building a Jewish state. If you want, they should have noticed, and some of them did, that what they are going to do is to build a Jewish state in the heart of the Arab world, in the heart of the Muslim world, and obviously against the will of the indigenous people of Palestine. But this was the age of colonialism and imperialism, and therefore that kind of consideration that we understand now is really the source of the conflict did not seem to bother them too much, either because they thought the Palestinians were not a problem, or they thought that if they were a problem, they would deal with it as settler colonial movements did by removing them from Palestine.
We'll come to what happened after 1917, but if you could quickly tell us about what was Palestine before, let's say, the Balfour Declaration. And I'm asking this question because a lot of people say there was no Palestine. It was Ottoman territories. There is no nationhood and nothing. So if you could respond to this narrative and tell us a little bit about what was Palestine before the First World War.
Palestine was a very pastoral country before the arrival of Zionism, and one that had most of the population lived in the countryside, but it also had an urban center, an urban elite, very thriving one. It was organically connected to Syria and Lebanon and Egypt. And therefore, although nationalism was already the discourse, a lot of intellectuals and members of the local elite were subscribing to, the kind of nationalism that people in Palestine and Syria and so on were talking about was more pan-Arab than local. So they were dreaming of an Arab republic that would replace the Ottomans. And that was already quite visible in the writings and preaching of a lot of activists and intellectuals through the 19th century, especially in the second half of the 19th century. So I think that it's very important to understand that with the arrival of British and French colonialism that replaced the Ottoman rule, that the classical policy of colonialism of divide and rule prevented a united Arab state from emerging, or at least a united Syria, with that, as the Arabs would call it, the greater Syria vision, that would include Syria, Lebanon, Jordan of today, Palestine, and Israel of today as one country, or one state, one nation state. So that was not permitted by the new masters of the Eastern West Asia, the British and the French. But there was definitely a process of modernization and the developing of self-determination and national identity before the arrival of Zionism to Palestine. But the wish was really to go along with the other Arab people who lived nearby, accepting that the Ottoman rule has come to an end, and believing, some at least believe, the British and the French, that the Arab world will not be a proper colonies, as India, for instance, was, but rather a mandate under a new international organization, the League of Nations, that would help them to become independent in due course. And as much as Iraqis hoped that Iraq would be independent, so did Palestinians wish for Palestine to be independent. So you had a very organic society that belonged to the Arab world, to the Eastern Mediterranean in particular, had its own features that were characteristic in its own dialect, its own identity, its own collective identity. Already in 1909, there was a newspaper, Palestine. So people did regard themselves as belonging to Palestine, but it is true that some of them, quite a lot of them, thought that in terms of national identity, they were part of something bigger, at least bigger than Palestine. And I suppose that once the colonial rule was imposed and supported the idea of a Jewish state instead of the Palestinian state, then the idea of an independent Palestine became much more popular instead of being part of a pan-Arab state in the future.
I think the hegemony of nationalist imagination sometimes creates a lot of amnesia about that moment where there was, on one hand, great efforts of carving out nationalist identities and spaces, as in Egypt, against the Ottoman rule, at the same time, it was much more broader in the sense that they also considered themselves as part of a larger Arab world, or even sometimes even the global South world, which was the antithesis of colonialism. We'll come to Arab nationalism again, but if you could tell us the disruption created by the First World War and the reoccupation and re-expansion of imperialism, particularly in the Middle East through the Mandate years. What happened during the Mandate years? How did the Zionist project, which was an ideology or were in papers in Europe, materialize in ground? Was it completely violence, shooting, holding people under guns, massacring, or were there side-by-side projects of buying up lands and turning barren lands into arable lands? These are also narrative tropes. So if you can clear a little bit of that haze about what happened during the Mandate years.
Yeah, definitely. So as I said, the mandatory system that was suggested to mostly countries in the Eastern Mediterranean or West Asia was eventually accepted by political movements as a possible future, kind of carving these areas into nation states under the supervision of the League of Nations, helping them to achieve independence with mandatory powers responsible for that progress. People were aware that Britain and France were not likely to give easily the control of these countries, and therefore you had liberation movements everywhere else that eventually ended with proper independence by the end of the Second World War. In Palestine, the predicament for the local Palestinians was far more serious. They were not only facing a British colonial rule that, like in other places where Britain ruled, such as Egypt, Jordan, and Iraq, was clearly reluctant to really allow proper independence for the countries and hope somehow to retain the empire in an indirect way. In Palestine, the British were also supporting the idea of turning Palestine into a Jewish state instead of an Arab state. And under the British umbrella, they allowed the Zionist settlers, who were a minority for all the period of the mandate, to build a state within a state, to build their own military power, their own economic capacity, to buy land and settle in the land, and so on. But in the end of the day, despite the British help, the Zionist movement failed in taking over land during the mandatory period. They only were able to buy between 6 to 7% of the land. I mean, they found Arab landowners, locals and some who lived outside, who were willing to sell them lands against the will of the Palestinian national movement. But it was not a substantial space or enough sufficient space to create a state. So I think what is really important about that mandatory period is that the Zionist leadership used the time of the British rule to prepare for a much more drastic move in order to implement an objective that is very typical to movements like the Zionist movement. And that's why we define it as a settler colonial movement. The Jews who came to Palestine were not the only Europeans that were outcast in Europe and were seeking to build a new Europe elsewhere outside of the continent at the expense of the native people who lived there. That's the way the United States and Canada were established. That's the way Australia and New Zealand came into being. And the logic that motivated all these projects, including the Zionist project, was that you had to eliminate the native population if you wanted to build the Europe instead of the Europe that didn't want you. And Zionism was not different. The mandatory period was a time where they didn't have the capacity to eliminate the Palestinians. So they waited for the right historical moment to try and do it, and they were partially successful in 1948 in doing it. But they have been preparing for that moment throughout the mandatory period, through building military capacity, economic capacity, international alliances, while the Palestinians still naively, through their leadership, believed that the fate of Palestine will not be different from the fate of Iraq or Jordan or Lebanon or Syria, namely that the people of those countries will determine in democratic elections the nature of the state after the mandatory period would end. So they were much less prepared for the moment when eventually the mandate ended. The Zionist movement was far better prepared for that moment, with this insidious idea that this would create the opportunity or produce the opportunity to build a Jewish state by massively expelling as many Palestinians as possible.
Talk about what happened at the end of this great preparation, the partition. I mean, before that, as you said, like about 94% of the land were with the Palestinians, probably a little less, like 80% maybe of arable land. But by 1948, with the partition plan, they got 55% probably. And it also came with the huge massacre, the Nakba, and the attempt of ethnic cleansing. Was the Nakba something structurally inbuilt within the settler colonial project, as you have described it, as a preparation for something almost inevitable? Or can it be understood more as contingent events within conflict that spilled over or that exploded into a tragic event?
No, I think it's a logical conclusion for the objective of the project of Zionism. Ironically, the Zionist movement in this, it was different in a way from the other settler colonial movement, really aspired to build also a democratic state, not just a Jewish state, but he wanted the demography to help this democracy to be entirely Jewish. So actually, not just in the name of the kind of ruthless settler colonial motive to get rid of local people, but also in the name of a noble idea such as democracy, they thought they had the right to remove the Palestinians so that they would have an absolute Jewish majority once the state is established, and therefore it could be democratic. The problem for them was that the demographic balance was against them. The Jewish population on the day that the Partition resolution was adopted by the United Nations, November 1947, was less than 1/3 of the population, less than 1/3. Most of them, by the way, people who came 2 or 3 years before. People ask, why didn't the Palestinians accept the Partition resolution? It was a mistake. How could they accept the idea of giving more than half of their homeland to one-third of the population, most of which were settlers who arrived few years earlier, not to mention the fact that there were already, by 1947, and that was too late, some Palestinian leaders who understood actually that these were not just poor Jewish refugees who were looking for haven, for a safe haven in Palestine, but that they came with the purpose of making Palestine a Jewish state. So it's not surprising that the Palestinians rejected the idea of partition. But the international community at the time, represented by the United Nations, did not include almost any of the colonized world. So it was mainly a global North kind of institution that was anyway Islamophobic and Arabophobic, and therefore did not regard the Palestinians as people with any rights. And those who were a bit more knowledgeable about the demographic situation and even about the danger that the creation of the Jewish state would come with the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, regarded it as, in the words of one of these diplomats, Western diplomats, as kind of tolerating a small injustice in order to rectify a bigger injustice. The bigger injustice, of course, had nothing to do with the Palestinian. That was the genocide of the Jews in Europe. So that was the background, actually, for how it eventually evolved. But yes, one should say, especially from the 1930s onwards, although even before that, the Zionist leadership prepared for that moment and was determined that in order to create a Jewish state, it will have to remove by force as many Palestinians as possible. And the moment the mandate ended, even before it ended, as I show in my book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, few months before the mandate ended, they understood that the British were not interested anymore in law and order or in anything that was happening in Palestine, but only how to withdraw safely to London. They started the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. And eventually this continued for about a year until the end of 1948. Really a ruthless, massive uprooting of the Palestinians from their towns and villages. And that's how so many Palestinians became refugees by the end of 1948.
I want to briefly understand the 1950s and 60s in the context of Arab nationalism. You mentioned earlier that Palestine was part of that larger Arab world, which was emerging even before Zionism and British and French imperialism interrupted the place. But it took a crescendo after the 1940s, late 1940s. I want to understand those events, not necessarily the very nitty gritties, but placing them in the larger context, because quite often it the events in 56, 67, and 73 are presented as a conflict between two equal sides, or a conflict that was fought for specific territories in a world where maps were just emerging. And what that does is that takes away the Palestine question from the whole description. It's almost as if India and Pakistan fought for its borders. So can you place those events in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s, and how to in the context of Palestine?
Yeah, I think we have to look at three different trajectories that's happening in that period. One is the ability of the Palestinian to resurrect the national movement after the trauma of 1948. It takes time, but eventually in the refugee camps, among the student unions, and so on, the Palestinian national movement is re-emerging with a clear program of making Palestine one democratic state and liberating it and making sure that the refugees will return to their homes. So that's one trajectory. And this is really welcomed by the left in the Arab world. It is welcomed by the movements for liberation in the global South, This is a time where the Palestinian national movement emulates some of the tactics and strategies that other third world liberation movement were employing in some places successfully, getting rid of imperialist or colonialist rule. However, unlike the other movements in the global south that eventually liberated or decolonized, if you want, the homeland, Palestine faced a far more formidable alliance. This was not just, most of the other countries faced an imperialist power, one imperialist power, one colonialist power, which I'm not underestimating the achievement of kicking them out and gaining independence. But the Palestinians were facing a global alliance of colonialist and imperialist power, not just one. They were adamant to sustain a Jewish state instead of a Palestinian state. So the national movement had very little chance of defeating Zionism, giving the strength of the global alliance that was behind Israel. Now, the second trajectory, which the Palestinians misunderstood, but we are clever in hindsight. I don't think if we lived in that period, we would have done better than they did, was a sense that because there was a resurgence of the idea of a pan-Arab nationalism, namely attempts by Jamal Abdel Nasser, but not only by him, by other leaders to unite the Arab world in order to face the challenges of domestic policies and foreign policies, that this unity would serve the liberation of Palestine. It served the liberation of Palestine only in words, not in actions. And therefore, the Palestinians could not really rely on the Arab world to fulfill the potential it had to help them to liberate Palestine and to face this international coalition that was against the Palestinians. So that's the second trajectory. And the third trajectory, which is important, is the way that the left was losing its power in the Arab world, both to political Islamic forces and to what you can call them center nationalists, but they were mostly, I'm not sure they were even proper ideologies. It was more about authoritarian regimes based on the power of the military that began to emerge in the Arab world and epitomize supposedly the national movements. And the decline of the Arab left, to my mind, really defeated any chance for the Arab world to play any positive role in the liberation of Palestine. We can see that today, of course, we may talk about it a bit later, but that today, of course, the most active force in the Arab world in support of the Palestinians is not the left. It's the political Islamic groups. But again, I don't think this time Palestinians are fooled by that. I don't think they really believe that the political Islamic groups would liberate them. They learned the lessons from the past. You need a consensual united Arab world if you want the Arab world to help you. And of course, in the meantime, the Arab regimes are moving far away from helping the Palestinians into the path of normalization, but we might talk about it later, but let's stick to the 50s, 60s, and the 70s. So we have a moment, a rare moment in the 70s. The United Nations represents the decolonized world. The decolonized world has a very strong left element in it. There is the famous decision in the United Nations equating Zionism with racism. The sense is that the Palestinian Liberation Organization is respected all over the global south and also among the left parties in the global north. And then there is a backlash led by the United States that cleverly, with alliances with political Islamic groups and other dictatorial Arab, not only Arab regimes in the global south, begins to unpack, to kind of dissolve this alliance. And then we go into the 80s and the 90s, and the Palestinians are really totally alone in the struggle. And surprisingly, due to their resilience and resistance, they're still here today. But this was not because there was great help from the Arab world or the Muslim world to them. It might change, but that's for me, the watershed in the 70s. The 73 war was already a war fought by two regimes in Damascus and Cairo that were interested in retrieving back territories that Israel occupied in 1967. They had no interest in the Palestinian issue. And without Syria and Egypt, these are the two most important countries. It was very difficult to create the regional alliance that was so important for the success of the Palestinian liberation struggle.
What you're saying basically is in the 70s, there is essentially a retreat of the secular Arab nationalist movement on one hand. On the other hand, there is a general peaking out of the left within the global south, and then there is a dissociation of the Palestinian movement from the larger Arab movement, and then the rise of the Islamist forces as one of the tactics within the larger coalition of the nationalist resistance. I think the other thing that also happened in the 80s and the 90s is within the Palestinian movement, the willingness to open up negotiation and diplomacy. And I'm thinking about the negotiations ultimately in the 90s and early 2000s. There is a narrative that says that, look, Egypt and Jordan in the 70s and the 90s accepted peace and they made some bargain around territories, and the Palestinians never did it. I think first of all, it's wrong to compare Egypt and Syria with Palestine, because Palestine has much greater issues of right of return of the refugees, question of settlements, Jerusalem itself, and border securities. And so to an extent that is not comparable to Jordan and Egypt. But can you tell us a little bit about how do you look at those negotiations in the 90s and early 2000s, given there is such a strong narrative that Palestinians never accept peace, they are violence, and look at others that did and they are doing better?
Yeah. This is a charade that was prepared by the more liberal forces, both in Israel and in the West. The message for the Palestinians was that actually international law is on their side. And according to international law, they will eventually get a small state in part of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip if they behave well, namely if they give up the idea of resistance and they go along with the dictates that would be provided to them by the Americans and the Israelis. Some Palestinians fell for it. One can understand why. I mean, the PLO was totally disempowered in the early 1990s. It was isolated in the Arab world because of the Yasser Arafat's support for the Saddam Hussein invasion of Kuwait, the disappearance of the Soviet Union, and America becoming, at that time, the unipower of the world. The military defeat in 1982 in Lebanon that pushed the PLO headquarters away from Palestine into Tunis. That happened already in 1982. And eventually, the uprising in 1987 was supposedly reciprocated by a global West who says, of course, you have a right to ask for a state and so on, which was never genuine. It was never genuine, and the Palestinians, at least some of them, but not all of them, we should say, a certain group of Palestinian leaders actually gave up on their basic charter, which was one democratic state from the river to the sea, in the hope that a pragmatic approach would win their allies exactly among the alliance that made among the pro-Israeli alliance. I mean, that was the strategy, which totally failed. If you go along with Pax Americana, if you go along with the Americans, at least you'll get something. If you go against them, you'll get nothing. That was the logic behind it. Well, it proved to be a very bad logic, and again, I'm very clever in hindsight. I'm not sure I would have seen clearly these things in the early 90s. So I'm really analyzing them without accusing anyone. I'm just saying that this clearly was not a genuine effort by the global West to offer the Palestinians any modicum of independence and self-determination, but it was offered as such, and it could have misled people to that effect. And of course, this all disappeared in the beginning of this century with the second uprising, and a totally different political reality in Palestine. You had eventually a different Palestinian entity in the Gaza Strip, led by the Hamas, a political Islamic group that gained a lot of support, not only because of its vision or dogma or because of its wish to create a theocracy, but because of the total failure of the other political forces in the Palestinian political camp. So people gave it a chance. And you had this entity in the West Bank that tried to claim that it was a state, but in any practical terms was not a state and is not a state. While, of course, at the same time, we have to take into account what goes on in Israel itself after 2000, which is a total shift to the right, to the messianic right that takes over Israeli politics, extends the Judaization of the West Bank, and deals with the Gaza Strip as a ghetto that needs to be eliminated, very much like a kind of a genocidal program that was already there before the 7th of October 2023. So this is where these efforts in the 1990s really led to, and were not motivated by genuine ideas. So to say that the Palestinian missed an opportunity there, or discarded a generous offer of peace, is really far from the truth of what happened. There was hardly any genuine effort there, a genuine motivation behind the offer. It was really a softer way to try and bury Palestine and the Palestinians. And eventually the Palestinians understood it and rejected it. And they still reject it, at least many of them, reject it today. And the more they reject a Western-led American project, the more Israel feels it has a carte blanche to punish them to the extent that it can fulfill its objective that it has not completed in 1948 of kind of eliminating Palestine and the Palestinians altogether.
We are discussing this in the context of what happened on October 7. If you can also, like, just a brief comment on what you said. It's interesting to note that the second Intifada, where a lot of violence was used, followed right after these negotiations, which indicates that the Palestinians, a lot of them were deeply disillusioned by the betrayal during the Oslo negotiations, as settlements continued to mount, and some of those openness, border checkpoints, and everything were coming up much more rigid, in a much more rigid way. I think this brings us pretty much to the contemporary moment. Before we discuss anything, if you can tell us, how do you look at what happened on October 7? I'm pretty sure you must be exhausted on answering this, but very briefly, was it an uprising? Was it a strategic move to exchange hostages? Was it to teach a lesson to Israelis to say, look, what violence does to your people, know it? What was it in your assessment?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, of course, that life after Oslo in both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip was far worse than it was before Oslo. So it was not just disappointment from the peace process that did not produce peace, but it was a peace process that produced harsher conditions of life, which is an explanation for the second Intifada. If the 7th of October, I
Can
think,
you can
has
you elaborate a little bit, because I think a lot of people don't know this. What
yeah,
happened?
yeah. As a result of the Oslo Accord, especially what is used to be called Oslo II, an agreement in 1994 that translated Oslo from being principles into reality on the ground, Israel divided both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip to enclaves, Palestinian enclaves. And those enclaves were separated from one another by a network of checkpoints, which was not there before Oslo, and about 600 checkpoints. And these checkpoints, everybody had to go through them unless you wanted to stay at home the whole day. You need to go to work, to study, to cultivate your land. You needed to go through a checkpoint, and they were daily humiliated in these checkpoints, pressure to become collaborators. This was a new feature of life, not to mention the fact that they were not allowed to move directly from one enclave to the other. They had to go through apartheid network of roads and so on. So the daily life after Oslo was far worse and as a daily experience for the Palestinians than it was before Oslo. And this was under the discourse of peace. So I think it's very important to understand that. Now, the Gaza, the 7th of October has several layers of explaining. And the first one is to realize that 70% of the people in the Gaza Strip are the descendants of the 1948 refugees. And the Gaza Strip itself was created in 1948. It didn't exist before 1948. And Israel created the Gaza Strip in 1948 as a mega refugee camp. It pushed hundreds of thousands of Palestinians into that area and closed it. I'm talking about the end of 1948. So there's always in Gaza this idea that they are living in a mega refugee camps created by Israel, which is something they all desire, generation after generation, to get out of it and to go back home. The second layer is the fact that the Jewish settlements built around the Gaza Strip were built on villages that were expelled by the Israelis as the last phase of the ethnic cleansing of 1948. So they're not only refugees from 48 and their descendants, these are refugees from the very settlements that were attacked on the 7th of October. And already in 2018, there was a march of these refugees called the Great March of Return, which actually indicated to the Israelis that there is a non-violent way, if they want, if they will respect the right of return, to change the impossible reality in Gaza. Of course, apart from building Gaza as a mega refugee camp, after the Hamas was elected in 2007, Israel turned the mega refugee camp into a mega prison. It totally sieged the Gaza Strip from the land, the air, and the sea. So you have this another kind of additional suffering. So you are both refugee, you are uprooted from areas that you can daily see, someone else taking them, and now you're also living as you're incarcerated. And you're incarcerated, and your only sin is your identity, not because you did something, because you are a Palestinian. Uh, and if this is not enough, because so many people are traditional, and there was the rise of political Islam, this is the time that also the messianic movements in Israel that becoming political power to reckon with are beginning to violate the sacredness of the Al-Aqsa mosque in Jerusalem. And not only Al-Aqsa mosque, they burn mosques in the West Bank and create this anti-Islamic action on a daily basis, humiliating Muslim and Islamic symbols. And that adds to the sense that this is something that cannot be tolerated anymore. On top of it, and I think that was also very, very important, and it's not justification, but it's an explanation. One of the worst feature of living as a Palestinians, especially in the West Bank, and the West Bank is organically connected to the Gaza Strip. It's the same families, the same people. is the imprisonment of people without trial, the political prisoners. This is one of the most important issues for Palestinians. The fact that thousands and thousands, almost every second or third Palestinian was a political prisoner in one time or another. Releasing the political prisoners is a totally consensual objective. Everybody agrees upon. And if you remember, Sinwar, Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, was released in exchange of prisoners between Israel released 1,000 political prisoners in return for one Israeli soldier. So I think the idea was there, if they released 1,000 for one soldier, if we take captive or we capture 200 soldiers, surely they will release all the political prisoners. Of course, this was a miscalculation because this particular neo-messianic Israeli government doesn't care about Israeli hostages, as we can clearly see, and was much more interested in using the Hamas attack as a pretext for genociding the people of Gaza. So I think these are all factors. But to be honest, I'm an historian, and I think we'll need some more time. We can also not interview actually the people who strategized. How much did they think that this action would cost the people of Gaza? How much were they aware of the possible consequences? Were they aware, did they say, despite the consequences? I mean, all kinds of things that I think we'll need time. But for me, it's very clear that this is another chapter that began in 1948, namely an Israeli attempt to eliminate the Palestinians and Palestinians resisting this attempt, sometimes by nonviolence, sometimes by violence. And this will continue, by the way. This is not the last intifada. This is not the last operation. But I do feel that we are at the end of this chapter rather than beginning of a new one. We are at the end of the chapter where by force you oppress millions of people and you succeed in preventing them from resisting in an effective way. I think that this will not go on for too long. But of course, it looks very dim, very gloomy right now. But I think that historically speaking, we are at the end of the chapter of oppression rather than the beginning of a new one.
I think the end of the chapter, we're also coming to the end of the interview, by the way, but
Right.
the end of the chapter also is a beginning of another chapter. And I'm so tempted to discuss a little bit on one of the famous debates. Now it's very well known, but when I read your book with Noam Chomsky, I mean, it's hard to win an argument against Noam Chomsky, but I think you would have the reputation of winning that argument. I remember you writing towards the end that someday I hope he will come back to our side, and we
Yeah.
don't know now what he thinks, but by now it's very, very clear that the one state argument has kind of won. I was, of course, very new to the material, and as student of this conflict now, genocide, I was fascinated by that. I still want to ask you, though, a lot of people are convinced that one state is a reasonable and just idea given hundreds of thousands, close to a million settlers with so much political leverage with the Zionist state, no one would tell them go back home. So given the reality on ground, one state is very, very reasonable theoretical suggestion. But the other side says that it's more or less like talking about revolution. People like us on the left talk about revolution. We believe it should be there because it's just, but it's sometimes hard to think about it given we are in such a cynical, pessimistic world. So a lot of people say, how would Palestinians and Israelis live side by side given there is so much animosity? And I'm not even talking about people who draw cultural divides, even practical people who don't
Yeah.
necessarily believe that Jews and Arabs are different. Even they say it's completely impractical. What did you say to them?
Yeah. First of all, in history, we have a lot of people who used to be very violent towards each other and eventually found a way of living together, not necessarily always in a romantic love story, but still in a coexistence that worked. And Europe, the United States, and many other parts of the world are full of these examples that bloody years of conflict were replaced by more reasonable coexistence. So I think history is on our side, actually. But more importantly, I think that this is, to my mind, not the real question. The real question is, um, can a regime that is an apartheid regime, that believe in the genocide of the Palestinians as a just means of establishing a Jewish state, can this continue to exist? Will it continue to exist? And are we allowed, first of all, to suggest a different regime based on equality, based on dismantling colonialist and segregationist institutions, and creating life which is not different from countries that were able to sustain political system that at least theoretically offer equality to their citizens regardless of who they are. So I think, first of all, this is the most logical dream to have. Yes, first of all, it's a dream, it's a vision, but it's very, if you don't imagine a different future will never come. And I think it's very important not to imagine a two-state solution, which means like, you kind of imagining actually the suffering going on, but in a different form. So that doesn't make sense at all. Secondly, I don't think the question is really will Jews and Arabs live together. They coexisted before. History, again, is on our side. Before 1948, Muslim, Christians, and Jews shared life in a genuine coexistence. I'm not idealizing the relationship, but it was cordial and it worked. It really worked. So there is a model from the past that we can be inspired by. Of course, it will have to be adapted to our times, but nonetheless, it existed. And the big question is rather, are Jews willing to live as equal citizens? Because Palestinians are willing to live as equal citizens. All their life, they're fighting to be equal. That's what they're asking. They're asking for natural, normal life. They don't ask for a program of ethnic cleansing the Jews. They're not talking about genociding the Jews. They're talking about the right to be equal citizens in their own homeland. And they ask for the right of the people who were expelled to come back. Now, if Jews in Israel will accept this, I'm sure, again, without idealizing it, I'm not saying it would be easy, but definitely this is a basis from a pragmatic and logical point of view to be optimistic that this is possible. Now, if Jews would reject this and would say we can only exist in Palestine through apartheid and privilege and colonization and ethnic cleansing, then they have no place in Palestine, in the future Palestine. Some whites in post-apartheid South Africa did not want to live in a post-apartheid state, and they left. Some of them, unfortunately, even came to the West Bank to enjoy another apartheid system. And that is the question. So I think the question is really shouldn't be directed towards the Palestinians. The Palestinians have proven from the very beginning of their encounter with the Zionist movement that what they are seeking is normal, equal life in their own homeland. The Zionist movement has proven from the very encounter with the Palestinians that it seeks to get rid of the Palestinians. So I do think that this is something that we should talk about much more in these terms. I do agree that in the last year and a half, a lot of Palestinians uh, uh, were aware that 94% of the Israeli Jews supported the genocide in Gaza. That I think is a setup. This is really something that we will have to challenge because that doesn't bode well for the future. I agree. I mean, if 94% of the Israeli Jews have no problem with the genocide of Gaza, then it's very understandable why Palestinians would say to you today, I'm not sure I want to share the land with such people. But I do hope that there will be more far-reaching impact also in the Israeli Jewish society, and at least some of them would understand that they were complicit in a crime against humanity, as did, some people in Europe were aware later on, and that was a good basis for building a new and better Europe. So I do think so that this is the question. The question is who is willing to share equally the life and who isn't, and that is a far more proper separation than Arabs or Jews in that respect, at least from my point of view.
I'm very mindful of your time, but just 2 minutes to end. It seems a little bit incomplete if I don't ask you one question about Syria, and not necessarily what's happening
Yeah.
in Syria, but given, of course, Syria was historically very important. The Assad government was not as important to the Palestinian movement, perhaps very directly as it used to be in the 60s and the 70s. But to the extent that Syria was a link for the axis of resistance, as it is called, support of Iran to Hezbollah and through Hezbollah support to
Yeah.
Hamas. Um, do you think the change of government in Syria is a significant blow to the Palestinian cause, or do you think it doesn't matter as much given the liberation would largely come through internal struggles?
Well, we still don't know exactly what post-Assad Syria it would look like. But like so many things that are happening in the last 2 years, they seem in the short run to be against the Palestinians, undoubtedly. But the question is the long run. In the long run, I think we should understand what's happening in Syria in a wider context than Syria. And this is the collapse of the political structure that Britain and France had built in this part of the world after the First World War through the famous or infamous Sykes-Picot Agreement. And I think the disintegration of Syria and the attempt to build a different one is only the beginning of a process by which the political entities that were, or outfits that were built through this colonialist arrangement after the First World War is not working. It doesn't reflect the mosaic of identities in the Arab world. It doesn't cater for the real problem of the people in the world. This is an area with a lot of poor people whose basic needs are not attended by the governments and rulers. And Israel is part of it. Palestine is part of it. So I really am, I'm optimistic in the terms that I can see the disintegration of a certain political system that I thought was invalid morally, did not cater for for the people's concern, and particularly discriminated against the Palestinians. So that's why I was against it. Now, I'm worried as a historian whether we will be able to replace this with a better system. Because a disintegration of system does not always ensure a better system. We can see it in some very poor examples of decolonization that happen in certain parts of the world. So the question is really, is al-Julani in Syria really offering that kind of alliance that he's now talking about, which is a very positive way of looking, of building a different kind of an Eastern Mediterranean, or the Arabs call it the Mashriq, which includes Palestine? Or is he just saying something now that he does not believe in, and he will go back to more dogmatic ideas that characterized him when he was part of Al-Qaeda? So we don't know yet. We have to wait and see. But it does offer an option, a new horizon. It's a very dangerous moment, but it's also a very hopeful moment for the Palestinians. But definitely in the short run, like the election of Trump, like the rise of neo-fascist right-wing parties, including in India, unfortunately, if you don't mind me saying this.
Of course.
All this is not boding well for the Palestinians. From Modi to Urban to Trump, this is not leadership that will bring anything good to the world. But we are in a process, and the Palestinians are not alone in challenging populist, nationalist, racist politics. And the more, even a small victory in creating a different kind of politics elsewhere is a victory for the Palestinian. Any moment these political systems continue to exist, wherever they are, on the basis of nationalism, populism, and racism, of course, the liberation of Palestine is delayed. But I think that creates a clear idea of global alliances that Palestinians can be part of, and are not alone in this struggle.
The best part of talking to a historian is that one historians make us think about the short term and the long term simultaneously, and sometimes you can draw hope from the long term even when the short term is very bleak. Professor Ilan Pappe, thank you so much for your time. This was such an
Hi,
incredible.
my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.